Okay, so this is the November 20 lecture. We'll start with chapter 9 and sort of review where we're at when it comes to building the model of the macroeconomy. So we have now learned and derived the aggregate demand curve here through the ISLM model or the Mundell-Fleming model, which is basically the ISLM model, but with an open economy flavor in it, with either free capital mobility, small country assumption, but you'd have to decide whether the exchange rate is either fixed or floating. In either case, you will have a downward sloping aggregate demand, which is shown here. Furthermore, in our classes so far, we've been shifting the aggregate demand curve through purposeful policy, either monetary policy or fiscal policy. Here in figure 9-6, you've got this reduction in money supply here, which is a monetary policy change, which will shift aggregate demand curve to the left. And on the right image, you have an increase in money supply, which will shift aggregate demand curve to the right. And that's what we've been discussing and learning so far. So the difference is in this lecture, actually, this will be one video, and then chapter 13 will be its own video. We are now really thinking harder about aggregate supply. Okay. So by itself, aggregate demand is not enough, and we'll need aggregate supply. And aggregate supply is this relationship between the quantity of goods and service supplied or produced and the price level. Okay. And here we will use the sticky price assumption that some firms in the short run will have sticky prices, but in the long run, all prices will be flexible. So that's the key idea. All right. So to formalize that, we'll need two different aggregate supply curves. And the first one is the long run aggregate supply curve, or the vertical aggregate supply curve. This is close to the classical model. This is basically the classical model we discussed in chapter 3 and chapter 4, saying that the aggregate supply curve output is basically coming from fixed amounts of capital and labor and available technology. So output is just equal to Y bar, which is based on our productive capabilities. And according to this classical model, output does not depend on the price level, because output depends on these fundamental factors on K bar, L bar, and Y bar. And therefore, all of the adjustment from changes in aggregate demand will be going to changes in the price level. And we'll see that here with aggregate demand shifting, you'll move from this equilibrium A to this equilibrium B, and it's all adjusting based on price. So the next idea is the short-run aggregate supply curve, wherein prices are fixed. And in this case, the assumption that we've been having so far is that all prices in the economy in the short run will be fixed. And that's why the aggregate supply curve will be flat in the short run. The short-run equilibrium of the economy is the intersection of the aggregate demand curve and this horizontal aggregate supply curve, which you've seen here. Here you're starting at point A, and that's the equilibrium and the intersection between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, short run. And then there is a shock or a change in aggregate demand, and aggregate demand here shifts to the left. You'll notice that there's no adjustment in price, because price is fixed in the short run by construction, and all of the adjustment happens throughout through a lower or change in output. In this case, a lowering of output. We've also done this in the course, but now we will review the movement from the short run to the long run. Over long periods of time, prices are flexible and the aggregate supply is vertical. Changes in aggregate demand affect the price level, but not the output. Over short periods of time, prices are sticky and aggregate supply is flat. So here you've got depiction of the long run equilibrium. Here's the long run aggregate supply curve. Here's the price at which the long run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. And of course, aggregate demand and aggregate supply equals Y bar. So now we will discuss adjustments in the long run from a change in whenever you have an output, which is not the same as Y bar. Over the long run, there will be an adjustment in price such that this equilibrium will hold in the long run. And we will find that description here in 9-12. So in 9-12, you've got an initial equilibrium A, which is the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And then what happens here is that there is this shift in aggregate demand, either through a shock or a purposeful effect. The SRAS starts at this level, but will shift down as long as Y is less than Y bar. Okay, so that's something that we've discussed already in the class, in ISLM, and in Montel-Fleming. And what will happen is that there's these continual shifts in SRAS until the price will become equal to this level, which is consistent with point C. And the price will go lower because what we want is to move down along the new aggregate demand curve until Y equals Y bar. So in the long run, because aggregate demand curve has shifted to the left, it's consistent with a lower price in the short run aggregate supply curve and a lower price that's consistent with long run equilibrium. Okay. So next we'll be discussing stabilization policy. So a lot of the point of constructing these models is to understand how the government will react to changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And first, we will think about these exogenous events that shift these curves as so-called shocks. Okay, so typically because you have an aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, there'll be two kinds of shocks. One is called an aggregate demand shock or an aggregate supply shock, or demand shock or supply shock. So the term stabilization policy refers to policy actions aimed at reducing the severity of short-run economic fluctuations. So if the Y is less than, for example, Y bar, or Y goes down, you can use stabilization policy to increase Y. So that's typically in the case of a recession or a depression. But you could also think of a situation wherein like prices are very high and output is sort of higher than the natural rate, and that's why inflation is rising. You could also use stabilization policy in those cases, as we might see. So in the following chapters, so let's talk about shocks to aggregate demand. So this is a picture of what will happen if there's a shock to aggregate demand. We already showed the picture where aggregate demand shifts to the left, and this is just a picture where aggregate demand shifts to the right. In this case, in the short run, A is the equilibrium. We move to B as the short run equilibrium, and then over time, the short run aggregate supply curve will shift up until it's consistent with point C at a higher price level, which is itself consistent with the long run aggregate supply equaling aggregate demand at the new aggregate demand, ADP. And that will result in a higher price level in the long run. And in the short run, it will result in a higher Y because you're moving from A to B. So let's think about shocks to aggregate supply. A supply shock is a shock that alters the cost of producing goods and services, and as a result, the prices. So these are examples here of a negative supply shock. So that these negative supply shocks or adverse supply shocks means they push costs and prices upward. And you could also think about a favorable supply shock that will lower costs of prices, costs of production and lower prices. Now, faced with an adverse supply shock, the policymaker has the ability to influence aggregate demand through that stabilization policy we had discussed. So there are two options. The first is to essentially wait for the long run. Let's look at 9-14. Here, there is an adverse supply shock upwards, and then output will go down, and then prices will also rise. So you're moving along the aggregate demand curve. You're moving from A to B in an adverse supply shock. So the first option here is simply to wait, because as the supply shock attenuates, disappears over time, you will then return from B to A normally, and the supply curve will shift down because Y is less than Y bar, and that process will stop until Y equals Y bar, and you're back to A. So prices will fall to restore full employment at the old price level. Okay. But of course, the cost of this is that you have to endure output that's less than Y bar. The second option is to expand aggregate demand to bring the economy closer or towards the natural level more quickly. If the increase in aggregate demand coincides with a shock, then the economy goes immediately from point A to point C. In this case, the Fed is said to accommodate the supply shock. So let's look at it from here. This 9-15 is basically the same as 9-14. But instead of depicting B, what we'll have here is that we're moving from B to C, okay? Because as the supply shock goes up, the supply curve shifts up because there's a negative supply shock. What will happen is that there's an accommodative expansion in aggregate demand, say by expansionary monetary policy in this case. And then what will happen is that aggregate demand will shift to the right. And instead of Y being less than Y bar and then slowly inching toward Y bar, it will jump directly to its old level. But the only problem with that is that if you'll notice, this new price SRA S2 is now consistent with the long run, and that's why there's a permanent increase, a permanently higher price level, and which is sort of the effect. So you could do, stabilize the economy or output using aggregate demand, fiscal or monetary policies to shift aggregate demand. But in these cases, you would have to accept a higher price level, in the end. So this is basically shifts of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So currently our understanding is in the short run, aggregate supply is flat like this. The purpose of Chapter 13 is sort of to come up with a more sophisticated short-run aggregate supply, and we'll find that in the short-run aggregate supply curve can shift, can basically not shift, but can slope upwards because of several market imperfections. And we'll start with Chapter 13 on the next video.